All right, so here we're looking at the graphical analysis of the consequences of a subsidy. And a subsidy is when the government will give a grant in money, just simply write a check to consumers or firms, really any actor in a microeconomy, in a market, because it believes that it wants more output of the product or at a cheaper price or both. Um, Things that get subsidized are things like agriculture get subsidized. We don't want farmers going out of business, for example. Solar panels is something that receives subsidies, and that's what we'll look at right here. The reason the government might subsidize solar panels is because, again, um, it's a good thing because it's clean, renewable, it reduces dependence on foreign oil, and there is not necessarily a lot of incentive for the market to provide solar panels as it is. They're very expensive to produce, and there's no economies of scale yet. You can't mass produce them. It's tough. Sometimes the government has to get a market going by providing a subsidy. One of the subsidies you studied last year in U.S. history was everything the government did to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, for example. It wouldn't get built without that. A subsidy, when it being paid to a producer, has the effect of shifting the supply curve to the right. Now, the reason for that is because the subsidy is just simply a check written per unit to the producer for each unit sold. So what that means is that it has kind of effectively reduced the cost associated with producing that quantity of output, or turn it around the other way and say producers are now willing to produce at a greater output and a lower price because they know they're going to get this check from the government. Say, oh, you're going to pay me for each unit sold? Sure, I'll actually be willing to produce more at lower prices because I know I got that check in the bank. Every unit I sell, you're going to pay me part of it. Sure, I'll produce more at lower prices because remember, the shape and placement of the supply curve depends upon the profit motive. But if the government's going to write you a check, the profit motive, your calculations on profit are a little different. You'd be willing to accept lower prices and sell larger quantities because the more you sell, the more you get paid by the government. And the willingness to accept the lower price from consumers because, after all, the government is paying most of the bill. So that's why the supply curve will shift to the right in the analysis, because the supplier is willing and able to accept lower prices and greater quantities sold because the government's paying the bill. The subsidy is equal to the space between the original supply curve and the new supply curve with the subsidy. New supply curve with the subsidy. In the market at equilibrium before the subsidy is introduced, we have PEQ and QEQ. Here's PEQ and QEQ, price at equilibrium, quantity equilibrium. This is what the market would allocate if the government did not get involved. Here is the equilibrium right there. That's actually an EQ. It's written really small. But when the government introduces a subsidy, what we see is that effectively the firm's supply curve will shift to the right. Now, nothing happens to the demand curve because the demanders haven't been subsidized. Their tastes and preferences haven't changed anything. All the non-price determinants of demand are the same. So the demand curve stays put. We now have a new equilibrium at the subsidy. At the original price, we'd have a surplus, which drives prices down, expands quantity, etc., which is a good thing. I sort of skipped over that quickly because that's our simple market dynamics. The surplus quantity drives the prices down. Anyway, here we are. What happens now is that consumers only have to pay a price of P1, right? Because here's the new equilibrium paid. That's the new price. And this many gets sold in the market, Q2. But the producers basically pocket a price of P3 because the government pays the subsidy here. The government pays the subsidy. Do we get more solar panels? Yes, QEQ to Q2. Are they at a lower price to consumers? Yes, P1. Is the producer hurt by any of this? Is it made it harder on the producer? No, not at all. They're still accepting. In fact, they're getting greater than the original equilibrium price. They're getting this new price of P3. This is wonderful for the producers. Who is really paying the price, if you'll excuse the pun? Who's making this happen? Well, it's the government. The real negative consequences are to the government. All of this green area is all the checks, or that's how big the check is, that the government had to write to subsidize this production. So again, going back, we have a market at equilibrium. Let me get another marker. We have a market at equilibrium for solar panels, but the government wants more solar panels at cheaper prices, right? The market's not providing the right, in the government's view, not providing the right amount or at the right price. Offer a subsidy tells to the supplier, we will pay you for a certain amount of money for each unit you produce and sell. Wonderful. That now allows us to produce and sell more at a lower cost. We're willing to accept a lower cost. Excuse me, I said that wrong. We're willing to accept a lower price and quantity because the government's paying making up the difference. In other words, we will produce more at each and every price because the government's going to pay a big chunk of them. We'll accept this price P1 from the consumer because we're not losing out. The government's going to make up whatever we had to give up. We'll accept lower prices at higher quantities because the government makes up the difference. I said that a million times, but I wanted to be sure that we understood why the supply curve shifts. We'll accept lower prices at higher quantities because the government pays the difference. This is this distance here, that's equal to the amount of the subsidy. That's the amount of the subsidy. Well, now that we have a new equilibrium at Q2, we just now see that, well, okay, the producer gets P1 from the consumer, but gets the subsidy from the government, effectively receiving a price of P3. The producer benefits. The producer's revenue is huge now. This whole thing, all this revenue comes from the consumers when they pay for it, plus the government subsidy. Producers make out really well. Consumers make out well because now they can buy more at lower prices. Okay, so society actually has more overall benefit. There's more overall benefit to society. We can easily see quite quickly how consumer and producer surplus changes as well. We can look at that, and we will look at that in a different screencast. This here is the amount of the subsidy. This comes out of the government's pocket. This is paid for by the gas tax or by the home heating oil tax or whatever tax it might be. This is why the government collects tax revenue to do things to pay, like paying for subsidizing solar panels. So anytime we subsidize, we just have to think, okay, a subsidy paid to a supplier reduces the price that suppliers are willing to receive at all various quantities of output. And the reason for that is because they don't have to worry about their profit motive as much. They can take a lower price from the consumer because the government's going to pay them for each unit they sell. So they say, okay, great, let's sell more. And even if we have to sell them at lower prices. So they do. That has the net effect of shifting their supply curve to the right. We now get a new equilibrium because remember that when you shift a supply curve, you get a disequilibrium. This distance would be the surplus of product would drive prices down. Output to the right is where we end up our new equilibrium with the subsidy. And then from here, at this number sold, Q2 sold, every unit gets a subsidy. In other words, a check from the government. So all these units got subsidies. This is the amount of the subsidy paid out by the government, paid to the producer. Consumers benefit, producers benefit, government is hurt. I don't really think it's good to think of government being hurt or not hurt because government isn't so much an entity, but rather just is, government is the sort of the agent for the social welfare of everybody in society. Anyway, that's how we look at a subsidy graphically.